Yo, what's up guys, hope you guys are doing good. So today we are going to see what if Naruto was used as Akatski's test segment part 2. Hope you will enjoy this video, so before we start please like the video and subscribe to our channel and hit bell notification, it motivates me to upload more fanfics for my lovely audience. So let's get started. Naruto had always hated the dark. It was a secret that he had always kept hidden, as according to the other kids, being afraid of the dark was for sissies. But as night fell over Konoha, he had always huddled in his bed, his terrified eyes watching the shadows and twisting them into monsters that leered at him, waiting to pounce as soon as he closed his eyes. Now, trapped in a cell with several other unfortunates, he couldn't understand whether he still hated darkness, or if he should welcome it. For while the darkness now signified the cramped confines of his cell, something that would give him claustrophobia for the rest of his life, it also meant that he didn't have to see the misery that no one could escape from, could pretend that he was back at his apartment and the lights had just blown out as they often did. The cell was mostly silent apart from the sobbing. Some of the other children talked to each other, but they refused to look at anyone else. Naruto noticed that those that spoke to each other were all different. Some had weird patterns on their skin that they would sometimes clutch at and howl. Some had funny eyes or teeth or skin. Some looked human, others seemed to be nothing but monsters. He noticed something else too: the children that vanished. Sometimes every day, sometimes spaced weeks apart, the guards would march up to the cells and begin dragging children out. They kicked, howled, sobbed, pleaded, but it made no difference. All of them were taken away, while the normal children would stare after them in horror, wondering if they'd come back. The strange children didn't. They already knew that the taken children would be lucky if they didn't. Naruto always pressed himself to the back of the cell whenever the guards came to take children away. He didn't want to be dragged off to wherever they were being taken, instincts honed from years of avoiding the hostility of Konoha telling him that it would not be a good place to go. Naruto was unaware of the fact that he wasn't in any danger the first few times the guards came. Orochimaru was working with the samples, checking to make sure that everything was ready, and planning out his schedule for creating his perfect host. That took time, and so for a couple of weeks, Naruto was safe. But then his luck ran out, and the whiskered face boy woke up in the cell to find the snake man standing outside, pointing at him. That one. The first ability they gave him was Samahata's. Well, they didn't give it to him, strictly. Orochimaru researched the Hoshigaki clan, and found that their swords were grown from the scales of previous swords, a child only being awarded one when they managed to break a scale off during a spar with an ordinary sword. The child would feed the fragment their own chakra, which would bind the sword to them and only them. The amount needed to grow the sword would kill a normal person, but the Hoshigaki clan were all born with incredibly large chakra reserves, meaning that they could survive providing the scales the chakra they needed to grow into a sword. That worked out fine, as Naruto had a very large chakra reserve as well, one that would rival any child of the Hoshigaki clan. And as Orochimaru's chakra merged with his host's when he took over their bodies, the sword should respond to him as well as it did to Naruto. The Hoshigakis had always demanded that their children be awake through the procedure. Whether this was an active part of the sword growing or just a display of toughness Orochimaru didn't know, but he wasn't going to risk it. And so Naruto was strapped onto a chair with his palm forced to face upwards as the shard from Samahata was stabbed into it. The pain was terrible. Not from the stabbing, that was merely a sharp flash that was over quickly, but from the slow, aching feeling of having his chakra sucked out of him. The 6-year-old slumped over when the procedure was done, but just before he passed out, he saw what looked like a small dagger made out of purple scales, and heard Orochimaru say smugly, "Experiment a success." The group of children in the cell slowly thinned. Naruto counted them, using his fingers like the academy had taught them. There were 11 of them now, and it had gone very quiet. The kids that had come in with him had stopped talking a while ago, and the older ones had never spoken a word to him. They didn't see any point. To them, everyone was going to die anyway, so it was not much use making friends. Naruto didn't like the quietness. He was a loud child by nature, and he disliked not being able to talk because no one else wanted to. He was also homesick, but also worried. Where was the old man, and the other ninja that were supposed to protect him? Why had no one come? The Sandaime stared down at the paperwork in front of him, seemingly reading it with great attention. In reality, his mind was far away, fixed on a certain blonde Jinchuriki that had vanished from Konoha several months ago. He had not realized that Naruto was missing for a while, something that he bitterly regretted. His visits to the boy had slowly been cut down to once a month by the sheer amount of work the elderly Kage had to go through, and this month had been particularly hectic. By the time he had been able to go out to visit Naruto, only to discover the boy missing, the trail had long since gone cold. That hadn't stopped him trying though. Naruto was more than the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi. He was the son of one of his dearest friends, and the boy that Sandaime viewed as his own grandchild. He had mustered the finest of the Inuzuka to track him down, but they returned empty-handed, saying that the trail was too old for them to follow. The Sandaime suspected that they had not tried as hard as they should have, being eager to get rid of the demon brat, but he had no way to prove it, and so dismissed them. But now all that he could do was hope that Naruto would one day return to them. Sighing, Sarutobi looked up at the portraits of the Kages on the wall, his gaze landing on the blue-eyed visage of the Yondaime. Minato, we have truly failed you. Orochimaru smirked as he examined the weapon that the scales had grown into. It was nowhere near the length of Samahata, which was to be expected, considering it was nowhere near the sword in terms of age and how much chakra it had consumed. Right now, it was the size of an ordinary kunai, albeit one covered in scales that shot up whenever someone brought their hand near. The color of the blade had changed as well. The blue scales had mutated into a dark indigo, and Orochimaru wasn't sure if it was a normal result of a new sword being created, or whether Naruto's chakra, tainted by the Kyuubi, produced a unique reaction. Either way, he was happy. The sword was not as good as his Kusanagi, of course, but it was worthy of his new form, and he looked forward to testing it against its parent when he struck Akatsuki down. But now was not the time to think of such things. He had some new test subjects coming in, some with very intriguing abilities, and he also wished to begin a new experiment with Naruto. It was time to see how he responded to that peculiar power of Hidan's. Naruto groaned as he opened his eyes. He was lying on a table, his arms and legs bound by straps. He pulled at them, and winced as they chafed against his skin. Be careful there. Those straps are tight. Naruto blearily looked up at the person standing next to the table. It was a teenager, with silver hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a pair of circular glasses sitting on the edge of his nose. He was staring down at Naruto as if he was looking at a bug under a microscope, and it made the younger boy uncomfortable. Who are you? The teen smiled. My name is Yakushi Kabuto, and I'm Orochimaru-sama's personal medic. I was sent to check that you were okay. Naruto looked up at him. Am I okay? Kabuto smiled. I think so. Then he whipped out a small kunai, and before Naruto could blink, stuck it into his chest. Naruto yelped in shock and pain. It wasn't as bad as he expected, but it still hurt like hell. Kabuto pulled out the knife and inspected the wound before nodding happily. Orochimaru-sama will be pleased. The pain was fading already, but Naruto was too angry to care. Why'd you do that? Kabuto smiled at him. Oh, didn't Orochimaru tell you? That operation earlier was designed to give you at least partial immortality, so that things like stabbing you would not harm you. Seeing as you're not dead, the experiment seems to have been a success, but I had to make sure. Naruto glared at him, but Kabuto didn't seem to care. Now come with me, Naruto-kun. Orochimaru has decided to move you to where we keep the successful experiments now. Naruto lay still as he unfastened the straps, debating whether to make a break for it. But then he looked up and saw a strange glint in Kabuto's eye that made him decide against it. Something told him that the teen was more dangerous than he let on. As he walked after Kabuto, Naruto noticed that there was a large mirror on the wall. Out of curiosity, it had been a long time since he had seen his reflection, he stopped to look into it. His eyes widened in shock. He was thinner than he used to be, no doubt thanks to the scarce amount of food that prisoners received. His teeth, while all there and intact, were beginning to yellow, and he resolved to find some toothpaste as soon as possible. His clothes were faded and ragged, and he would probably be utterly filthy if they did not insist that everyone showered before experimentation. But it was his hair that surprised him. It had grown longer than he remembered, the spikes sticking up in all directions while the front strands now touched his shoulders. However, what held his attention was the color. His hair now had a silvery cast to it, something that he definitely would have noticed before. After all, he had often proudly noted that his hair was the brightest in his class, beating out Ino's by far. Kabuto, having noticed that he was not following him, looked over to see what Naruto was looking at. He understood immediately. Apparently, all members of the religion that the guy who your immortality comes from belong to have silver hair. You probably got a diluted version of it because you're not an actual member. Now, come on. Naruto followed Kabuto, but his thoughts remained with his reflection as he wondered just how much this place was going to change him. The place where successful experiments were kept were a small improvement on the place where Naruto had stayed before. He was still in a cell, but on his own this time, and they had access to better food as well as a shower once a week. Still didn't change the fact that he was being locked up, or the fact that he didn't know why. He had asked the guards, but they had just angrily retorted about how he should be grateful that he was helping Orochimaru-sama in his great work. There was also another aspect that Naruto didn't like, having to fight. The successful experiments were probably going to be included in Orochimaru's army, and so he wanted them trained and ready to fight. He also wanted to see how well the changes he had implemented in them worked, as he did not call an experiment a total success until he was sure that their new abilities could work in a combat setting or some other way to benefit him. Naruto had been lumped in with them so that he could build up some skill. Orochimaru had no intention of possessing a body that he would then have to spend ages getting into shape. So Naruto was given training by both Kabuto and a handful of others under Orochimaru's command. At the moment, they were only working with taijutsu, and Naruto was taught the basics of the hubby style, which, though it was very different to what he'd been shown in the academy, was also easier to learn, as he didn't have teachers trying to sabotage him, or only teaching him the barest minimum that they had to. He had also been introduced to kenjutsu, but he wasn't very good at it so far, getting beaten into a pulp every time by the strange boy with the red markings under his eyes. Apparently, the news of his immortality had spread, as his trainers seemed to have no problem with stabbing and slicing him to pieces, something literally. They had also begun to research the religion that Kabuto had spoken of, Jushinism. Naruto had felt sick as he read of ceremonies involving hundreds of human sacrifices, books that ranted about how not killing your opponents was the ultimate dishonor, and the rituals where Jushinists mutilated themselves in order to bring their victims the maximum amount of agony before they died. The more he read, the more his disgust grew. There was no way he was ever going to use that sort of stuff. It looked horrible, and what sort of Hokage would he be if he went round cutting people up? A few weeks later, Kabuto informed him that he was to undergo another transfusion. Naruto had not protested, as he had a feeling that it wouldn't be much good. But they had still drugged his food, and Naruto had been out like a light the moment he had finished the soup that he had been given. When he woke up, at first he couldn't see anything different. His eyes, his hair, his teeth, all were still the same. But then his shirt slipped, and he saw the neat stitches of black thread that ran diagonally from the top of his shoulders to the beginning of his armpits. And he screamed. Kabuto had come to investigate what was wrong, fearing that the experiment had not gone as well as they'd thought. Naruto had demanded an explanation in a fearful voice, and it was given brutally, that it was part of the experiment, and these strange black threads had been woven through his body. He did not go into much detail about what they would be used for, but Naruto did not like what he did say about them, especially when he mentioned human hearts. After the teen had gone, Naruto slumped to the floor, stroking the stitches as he stared at them in bewilderment and fear. Words came floating back to him from his days in Konoha, whispered by strangers, muttered by his teachers, and shouted at by his peers. Freak. Monster. Demon. The old man had always told him to ignore them, promising Naruto that of course he was no different than them. But now, could he really say that he was like anyone anymore? Orochimaru frowned as he read over the reports given to him by Kabuto. They had just started to get Naruto to manipulate the threads, but it was slow work. He had managed to extend his arms, but at the sight of the threads coming out of his body he had stopped immediately and retracted them. Naruto-kun's training is going slowly. Kabuto nodded. He does show a certain dislike of the changes we've put on him so far, and they aren't even that bad compared to the others we intend to do. But his taijutsu is coming along nicely, and he is beginning to pick up kenjutsu. I recommend that we start his training on chakra control soon, or he'll never be able to perform jutsus as efficiently as he should do. Orochimaru waved his hand. I cannot spare you for his training much longer. You have other work to do. Kabuto frowned, but nodded. Very well. What of his training now? Orochimaru rested his head on his knuckles. I won't accept my vessel being trained by substandard teachers. Summon Gurren. Kabuto blinked in shock. Orochimaru-sama, are you sure? Orochimaru chuckled. Yes. She'll provide the training he needs, and could well bring him round to my view. When I take his body, it'll be much easier if it is offered willingly. Kabuto nodded slowly, though it was obvious that he was not happy about this. Very well. Orochimaru watched him leave the room, before deciding to send someone to Kiri. There had been rumors of Akatsuki traveling to there, and it appeared that they had a new member, someone who apparently had mouths in his hands. Gurren smiled as she leaned over the edge of the balcony, savoring the chaos that was rampaging below her. She was in the buildings that housed some Orochimaru's first successful experiments, that is, those who survived being branded with some of the first different cursed seals. But few other scientists would dub these creatures as a success. The once human figures had been warped into grotesque mockeries of their former selves, the price from drawing on the curse marked too much. Now unable to do anything but listen to their own bloodlust, they were confined in a remote area, and studied by a few of Orochimaru's researchers, mainly by observing them fight. However, the crazed experiments hardly ever fought without killing their opponent, and their number was slowly being whittled down. None of that concerned Gurren. She had been ordered to keep an eye on them by Orochimaru, and she had obeyed. But she only had to stay here until they were all gone, and from the looks of things, that wouldn't take too long. Soon, she would be back at Orochimaru's main base, serving him as was her only wish. Gurren-sama. The 16-year-old turned around to see one of the scientists bowing to her, his hands shaking from nerves. Kabuto-sama has sent a letter. Gurren frowned. She did not like Kabuto, not at all. He was too quiet, too plotting, too nice guy while secretly being evil, and he was loyal to himself, not to Orochimaru. If someone cut him a better deal, he would betray the snake Sannin in an instant. Gurren was also, if she was honest with herself, more than a little jealous of him. Kabuto was Orochimaru's right-hand man, his personal medic, and the one he trusted above all others, including her, a fact that never failed to fill the crystal user with bitterness. Still, Kabuto had to be obeyed, for now. Well, give it to me. The scientist nodded, and quickly handed over the letter before scurrying away. Gurren carelessly began scanning it. As she reached the third line, her eyes bulged, and by the time she had finished the letter, she was teetering on the edge of collapsing from shock. He wants me to do what? Naruto sat on the bed in his cell, staring dully at his arms. He had been sent some new clothing, probably after they realized that his old ones were now little more than scraps of cloth linked by frayed threads. If it had been in any other place, He would have been excited to receive clothes like these, some mesh tops, black pants like he had seen some of the ninja around his village wear, fingerless gloves, a full body suit, even a gray flak jacket, though it was a bit big for him. But in this gloomy place, he found it hard to conjure up any excitement at all. He had put on one of the mesh top and black pants, not wanting to have to wear the smelly rags he had been for the last few weeks. But as soon as Naruto slipped on the top, he had realized his mistake. The large rags had at least covered the stitches, something which the mesh top didn't. Now there was nothing to hide the tiny black threads woven through his skin, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from them, no matter how much fear and disgust ran through him as he looked at them. Naruto lifted his hand, and gently touched the stitches that ran down his right shoulder. They seemed to be pulled tight, but he concentrated, and his arm fell to the floor, connected to his shoulder by a thick snake of black threads. A bitter smile pulled at Naruto's lips, and the threads began to move, rising and bending like a real arm, though it was doubtful that any human limb could twist into some the positions he made the threads do. Naruto didn't like what had been done to him, in fact he hated it. But in the darkness of his cell, with no company but his own, he had turned to using the threads as entertainment, a way to stave off the loneliness, the fear, and also, the frustration. During his first week in wherever the hell this was, Naruto had not expected to stay long. He had been sure that the old man would come looking for him, and if not him, then at least some of the ninjas who had been kind to him before he came here. But as the days dragged by, a sense of hopelessness had crept up at him as he had looked around to see no sign of anyone coming to rescue him. Where were they? Why hadn't they come? Danzo stared down at the reports sent back to him by one of his agents, a smirk on his lips. So, it's true. Orochimaru has him. The root agent in front of his desk nodded. Hi, Danzo-sama. We managed to sneak in a few agents into his organization. They weren't able to discover much as hidden with Orochimaru, but they were able to find out that he has the Jinchuriki, and seems to be performing a variety of experiments on him, though they are not sure the nature of those experiments. Danzo leaned back in his chair. I see. This was intriguing news. As soon as Uzumaki had disappeared, he had sent out agents from Root to find him, and if necessary, eliminate him. After all, they couldn't have the most powerful of the Bu in the hands of another village. But Orochimaru, that was another matter. Danzo had made deals with the Sannin before, and they had proved to be very profitable. Perhaps a similar deal could be made for Uzumaki. And if not, Danzo's lips curled back into a grin. Well, he'd be a very poor character to leave a child in the hands of a monster like Orochimaru, wouldn't he? It was a few weeks after Naruto had been given the black threads, and he was standing in the middle of his cell, a single black thread darting around the cramped space. He watched it with almost a flicker of pride, for he was beginning to advance quite well with manipulating the threads outside his body. He couldn't move many threads at the speed that he could move on, but if they didn't disturb him for a while, he should be able to get better with the technique. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, and quickly withdrew the thread back into his body, sinking down onto his bed. Someone was coming, and he didn't want to be caught using the threads. It was bad enough having to push them out in front of Kabuto and some of the other scientists as they gawked at him, and he knew that if they found him playing around with them, he'd be hauled off so that they could observe him again, and he got enough of that already. It didn't take long for the owner of the footsteps, Kabuto, to appear. Naruto, come. There is someone Orochimaru-sama desires you to meet. Naruto nodded wearily, rising to his feet. Kabuto unlocked the door of the cell and led him out, the small boy following him through the dark corridors until they came to one of the labs. Naruto looked at the silver-haired boy questioningly. Orochimaru-sama wishes to implant a new ability within you before you meet this person. Naruto stiffened in fear, but before he could move, Kabuto's hand darted towards him, a needle gleaming between his fingers. Naruto felt a sharp prick, but before he could register anything else, he blacked out. Gurren knelt in front of her master, looking up at him in adoration and a hint of confusion. You Said you wanted me to train someone. Orochimaru chuckled silkily, looking down at his subordinate with amusement. Yes. I have decided to take on a new body, one that will elevate me above all, but currently, it is a child, weak and clumsy. I need you to shape him into a true shinobi, for when I take his form in 3 years. Trying to hide her disappointment at not being the one chosen for the jutsu, Gurren nodded. Hi, Orochimaru-sama. Orochimaru smiled, his teeth glinting in the candlelight. Good. Naruto groaned as he opened his eyes. Everything looked a bit fuzzy, and his head was hurting. Gingerly, he reached up and felt through the silvery blonde spikes. Despite the pain, there seemed to be no damage, not even a lump, which Naruto felt thankful for, though he was still annoyed at Kabuto for knocking him out, while also nervous about what change had been wrought in him this time. There were no straps holding him down to the table, so he cautiously got up and staggered over to the mirror, feeling a little weak after the anesthetic that had been pumped into him for the operation. Leaning forward, he examined his appearance, and frowned. His hair was the same. His eyes seemed to be the same. His nose, his teeth, his hands, his feet, all didn't show any signs of change. But they had definitely done something to him. What was it? The door to the lab opened, and Kabuto came in. Ah, you're awake, Naruto. The younger boy stared up at him, his eyes narrowed. Kabuto chuckled at his expression. Oh, don't look so glum, Naruto. You surely didn't want to be awake for the procedure, even if Orochimaru-sama regards it as one of the most valuable. Naruto tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak, reminding him that he hadn't had a drink for a while. What? What did you do to me? Kabuto merely smiled, and gestured for him to follow. You'll find out soon enough. Now, come on. We need to get going. Now feeling quite nervous, Naruto followed him, but he was determined to get answers, just preferably not from this creepy guy. They stepped out of the lab, and into a corridor that was bathed in a flickering orange light from the torches fixed to the stone walls. It looked like a scene from the stories that the old man had told him about, the ones where the villains had trapped the heroes in their dungeons, which was kind of appropriate, now that Naruto thought about it. Kabuto gestured for him to go down another corridor, but before Naruto could take a step, the sounds of footsteps approached, along with sniffles and shouts of anger. Naruto looked up, and gasped. 5 Oto shinobi were leading a mass of children towards them, about 20 if his ability to count hadn't deserted him since he'd arrived here. Their ages ranged from the battle-scarred teenager wearing a headband with the symbol of Iowa who looked about 15 to the little girl about 2 younger than Naruto with curly blonde hair and a neat blue dress that made her look like a small doll in his opinion. All looked very frightened, and Naruto let his gaze wander so that he didn't have to focus too much on their terror, which was completely justified. But he froze as he spotted a familiar face. Amy. The purple-haired girl looked up at the sound of her name, and her eyes narrowed in confusion when she saw the boy who had called it, clearly not recognizing him. But before she could say a word, one of the guards whacked her head and ordered her to follow the other children down another corridor. Kabuto looked down at Naruto, his eyes glinting behind his glasses. You know her. Naruto frowned. He knew Amy from his days in the playground, where she and her friends had pushed him off the swing several times. A little. But what's she doing here? He knew that Amy was an orphan, like him, but unlike him, she was well looked after, and he couldn't imagine what she'd be doing in this place. Kabuto shrugged, a sly smile on his face. We get children sent to us from every village, Naruto. They don't want to make Orochimaru-sama angry after all. Even Konoha does it. That's why we have you. Naruto stiffened. What? It's simple. You have a special gift that allows you to survive the transfusions we give you when many others would not. When Orochimaru-sama heard about you, he asked Konoha for you. From what I hear, they were quite happy to get rid of you. Naruto stared at the older boy in shock, his hands clenched. Surely they wouldn't have just tossed him aside. Surely the old man wouldn't give him to these people. But the woman who had knocked him out had been the old man's friend. And he knew that no one apart from the old man had liked him. Had seemed to like him. What if he had just been pretending, like the old lady that had given him some dango that turned out to be filled with glass? Gigi. Kabuto smirked as he saw the boy's eyes fill with tears. Orochimaru may not be able to take on the boy's body until 3 years had passed, but that didn't mean that he didn't have other uses for Naruto, and the less ties he had to anywhere apart from Oto, the better. Orochimaru smirked as he gazed down at the puppet of the Sandaime cage. It had been difficult extracting the genetic material needed, as Sasori had stuffed the doll full of weapons, all of which were poisoned. He couldn't have any samples tainted after all. But there was a few patches where the puppet master had not touched, and Orochimaru found what was needed in there. A good thing too, as he would have been very peeved if he was not able to take the Kekkei Genkai that he had once feared. The cage's abilities were worth preserving, but it irked him to think that Sasori had carelessly turned this man into a weapon without taking precautions. Orochimaru liked having backups of the Kekkei Genkai that Sound had amassed, one of the reasons he tried so many transplants. However, that was not the only thing he had learned from the man's body. Orochimaru was a scientist after all, and a power-hungry one at that. He had carefully examined the corpse, slowly piercing together the puzzle of human puppets, bit by bit. Such a useful craft after all. Normally, if bloodline carriers refused to join him, he would destroy them and take genetic samples, hoping to replicate their abilities within loyal followers. But with the skill of making human puppets at his disposal, he could make further uses of their bodies. He liked the thought of using dead foes against his opponents, and made a mental note to have a look at the Sarutobi cemetery. Wouldn't it pain his old teacher to have to fight his darling wife, the only person he had cherished above his favored student? And even then, he could take Sasori's idea further. He had had a good look at his partner during his time with Akatsuki, and along with his wooden scent, Orochimaru was sure that he had glimpsed metal joints and skin that gleamed unnaturally beneath the man's cloak. However, he was pretty sure that the person he had fought beside wasn't just another puppet. No one could be out of the range of his chakra-sensing abelites and control someone of Sasori's abilities at the same time. Which meant that Sasori had somehow turned himself into a puppet, and stayed alive, creating his own version of immortality. Orochimaru had no interest in something like that for himself. He already had a form of immortality with his body-stealing jutsu, something that would no longer be needed with Naruto's body. However, he had several people that he found useful that he wouldn't mind keeping around. Kimimaro for one. The boy was beginning to show signs of an illness that Kabuto couldn't seem to cure. But a puppet could not get sick, and he was sure that the Kagaya would not mind being transformed into one, if Orochimaru requested demanded. Jiraiya stared down at the paper clutched between his fingers, his eyes scanning the hastily written words. When he had heard that Orochimaru was constructing a hidden village with himself as the head, the Toad Sannin had wasted no time in planting spies within his ranks, selecting only the best for the job. The laboratories in Konoha had proved to him what a monster his teammate had become, and he knew that any spy detected would probably end up on his operating table. But Jiraiya couldn't afford to let that hold him back. He knew that Orochimaru held a grudge against Konoha, and he was probably plotting its downfall the moment he stepped out of it. And if that was the case, then Jiraiya had to know, so that he could warn the village he loved that it was in danger. His spies had picked up whispers of plans to crush Konoha, but from what they could discern, Orochimaru had no concrete plans yet for destroying the village. No, it was not for that one of his spies had risked her life by sending him an unscheduled report. It was Naruto. Jiraiya's fist clenched. A few months back, he had received news from the Sandaime that his godson had gone missing, vanished without a trace. Jiraiya had tried to reassure himself that it was not the first time that the child had gone missing. From what he had heard, Naruto had various hiding places around Konoha, that he would sometimes hole himself up in when the disdain of the village got too much. As the days turned into months, A voice had whispered in his head that surely the child wouldn't have stayed away for this long, that something must have happened to him. But Jiraiya had ignored it, and continued with his life. But this letter had changed everything. His spy reported that she had seen a child being taken into Oto, a child with whisker marks on his face and spiky blonde hair. She had not reported it at the time. After all, unusual children being delivered to Orochimaru was nothing new. But later, she had seen the child again, only this time, his hair had been threaded with silver, and there had been black stitches decorating his shoulder. And from what she had been able to find out, Orochimaru was planning something for the child. Something big. Jiraiya's eyes narrowed. He could still remember the day Minato had asked him to be the godfather of his unborn child, one arm slung around Kushina's shoulders as they both gazed at him pleadingly. Jiraiya had been shocked, but flattered, and agreed. But he'd imagined himself as an uncle, dropping in on the child from time to time when he visited Kushina and Minato. Never had he imagined that his student would be snatched away in the ultimate sacrifice for his village. Jiraiya had been the one to cut the cord, to carry the still bleeding infant to Minato while the Kyuubi raged outside the village. When it was over, he had been the one who had taken Naruto back to Kushina, and watched helplessly as the hardened Junin from Whirlpool had fallen to the floor and sobbed as if she couldn't stop. He had left the village, telling himself that Naruto didn't need him, that he had his mother. However, though Kushina had her son, she'd been forced to move out of the Namikaze mansion. She and Minato hadn't gotten around to getting married, and so she had no legal claim to his property. And by Konoha's law, Naruto could only claim his inheritance when he turned 18, and even that was only if no legitimate heirs came out of the woodwork. As Minato had been the last of his family, Jiraiya knew that it was unlikely any other Namikazes would be turning up, but it was still a bitter blow for Kushina, who was already ostracized for being the mother of the demon brat. But she loved her son, and did her best to make things work. She'd bought an apartment, and started taking on more dangerous missions, figuring that the added risk was worth it, as the extra pay meant that she didn't have to go on so many, and could spend more time with her baby. But then, she had mysteriously vanished while on a routine document-carrying mission. No one knew if she had been ambushed or had left voluntarily, but either way, it was an extremely serious situation. Minato had been teaching Kushina the Hirishin before he died along with the Rasengan, and she'd also worked with Minato on the Shiki Fujin, being an amateur seal user. While she hadn't had the time to continue working on them herself, any of those three would be very useful to a village, and he knew that Kushina would be welcomed with open arms anywhere if she came offering them. After 3 months of searching turned up nothing, she was declared dead, leaving Naruto alone in the world. The Sandaime had sent Jiraiya a message, offering him Naruto's guardianship, but the Toad Sannin had still been hurting over the loss of his student, and felt that he couldn't face seeing a carbon copy of him. Instead, he'd continued with his travels, trusting that Sarutobi could keep the boy safe. Only he hadn't been able to. Naruto was in the clutches of Orochimaru, undergoing what sounded like gruesome experiments for an unknown purpose that Jiraiya would have staked his life for not being good for anyone, Naruto included. Jiraiya could no longer brush Naruto off as safer without him. He knew for a fact that Orochimaru would show no mercy, despite the fact that Naruto was no more than 6 years old. Sighing, Jiraiya tore the letter into tiny pieces, which he let flutter away into his campfire. Otogakur was going to be a hard nut to crack, especially as he was Orochimaru's famous ex-teammate. But he had to do it. It was time he started being a proper godfather. Naruto stared up at the girl, really, who was looking down at him with narrowed eyes. So, this is the brat that's going to be the next host. Kabuto, who was standing behind him, nodded. Yes. Don't be fooled by his appearance, he's had abilities added, and he'll be getting more. Naruto stiffened at these words, but the girl nodded. Of course. Orochimaru-sama would never take a weak host. There was an odd note in her voice as she said that sentence, but Naruto was too busy wondering what she meant by host to pay attention. Then I'll leave you with him. Oh, and remember, he may be immortal, but you still can't damage him too much. A gleam appeared in the girl's eye, and Naruto caught a flicker of movement by his feet. He jumped into the air, but one of the crystal needles that had shot up still managed to pierce his leg, jutting through his thigh. Hissing in pain, he grasped one of the other needles that were sticking out of the ground, and pushed down, giving him the momentum he needed to lift his leg off. The blue-haired girl smirked. Don't damage him too much. I get it. Then I'll leave you to it. Sasori's eyes flickered over the reports that his spy had given to him, his fingers clenched. Orochimaru had been performing experiments on his puppet. His favorite puppet. Capturing the Sandame cage had injured him badly, and had been the deciding factor in his decision to convert himself into a true human puppet. And now it was lying on an operating table, years of work being undone by that snake. He wasn't going to try attacking Orochimaru directly. No, that would be foolish. What he intended to do was to gain revenge using cunning and skill. Sasori Dana, the former of which his partner didn't seem to have. The puppet master resisted the urge to roll his eyes as Deidara sat down next to him, rubbing his cheek, where Sasori could see a cut, still dripping blood. Apparently someone had shot a shuriken attached to a wire up at him while he was flying on one of his clay birds, but the bomber had managed to dodge before it could do any serious damage. The opponent was gone by the time Deidara had flown down, and Sasori suspected that it had probably been some wet behind the ears ninja that had panicked when they spotted the white object zooming through the air. It hadn't been the first time Deidara had been attacked while flying low, and he doubted that it would be the last. Arashi bowed before his master, holding out a vial within which a red liquid was contained. As you ordered, Orochimaru-sama. The snake Sanin leaned forward, taking the vial gently. Are you sure that this is the right one? The Fuma nodded quickly. Of course, Orochimaru-sama. My shuriken doesn't miss. The blood is his. Orochimaru chuckled menacingly. Good. Now I have all the ingredients I need. And my new body can finally be perfected. Naruto panted as he ducked behind a tree, his eyes darting around wildly. When Kabuto had told him that he was going to be trained, he had been very excited. After all, being a ninja was the one thing that he had had to look forward to in Konoha, and it seemed one of the few things that this place could do to make him happy. He should have known that that would have been too much to ask. It had been 5 months since he had been started on this hellish regime, and in that time he had grown to hate his chakra with every ounce of his soul. According to Kabuto, he had too much of it, and so he was put through a strict training to control it. Tree climbing using only his feet while Gurren grew sharp crystals right below him. Walking on water while some of Orochimaru's aquatic experiments swam below the surface, waiting for him to slip in. Trying to keep hundreds of leaves clinging to his body as he balanced on a teetering pile of rocks. There seemed to be no end to his torment, and it was all because of his stupid chakra. They had not taught him any jutsus, as Orochimaru knew practically all of his subordinates' jutsus, and he saw no need to give Naruto any. However, someone had left a load of medical manuals in his cell, and having nothing better to do, Naruto had read them. It was very difficult, as he was very much out of practice when it came to his literary skills, but someone had helpfully written definitions in the margins for the complicated words, i.e., all of them. The manuals were filled with diagrams about the different parts of the body, with detailed descriptions about what they did. On the days when no one was free to torture him, Naruto spent hours lazily scanning the pages in an effort to starve off his boredom, as well as the memories of the kind old man whom he'd thought of as a grandfather. Who'd betrayed him? Soon, he had a basic grasp of human anatomy, and even started forcing the black threads to extend so that he could study them properly. Though it made him feel a bit ill to see the wire-like material twisting through his flesh, he had to admit, they did look interesting from a medical standpoint. Just not from the standpoint of a 7-year-old boy. Naruto was pulled from his thoughts as he caught a flash of blue out of the corner of his eye. Yelping, he ducked, and the crystal projectile embedded itself into the trunk of the tree he had been hiding behind. You'll have to do better than that, you little brat. Orochimaru-sama can't have a weak host. Naruto gritted his teeth as he looked up to see Gurren leaning over him. In the past few months, he had learned two key facts about the woman: she was devoted to Orochimaru, and she had a sadistic streak that ran deep. Neither of which was good for his training. He tried to get to his feet, but Gurren slashed down with a crystal blade, which embedded itself within his neck. Naruto let out a yell of pain, and Gurren snorted. Why Orochimaru-sama picked you to be his vessel, I'll never know. Naruto glared up at her. I don't know either. Why don't you ask him? Gurren gripped her blade, her eyes flashing. I would never presume to question Orochimaru-sama's decision. I merely think that you must have a hidden talent, because from what I can see, you're far too weak to host him. Naruto frowned. He had been hearing words like vessel and host for a while now, but he had never been able to ask about them. What do you even mean by that? Gurren cocked her head. What do you mean? Naruto waved his hand. You know, host. Gurren stared at him, shocked. You don't know. Naruto was beginning to get irritated. Know what? Gurren opened her mouth, but then closed it, before motioning for Naruto to sit down. Puzzled, but relieved by the fact that it didn't seem like she was going to attack him again, he obeyed. This is going to take some time, but don't interrupt. Perhaps after I tell you you'll see what an honor you've been granted. Naruto nodded, and Gurren smirked. Good boy. Now, it all began when Orochimaru-sama managed to invent this new jutsu. Naruto stared down at his hands in shock. They were a bit bigger than they had been in Konoha, and the nails were jagged, from where he had bitten them off to prevent them from growing too long. But they were his hands. Part of his body. The body that Orochimaru wanted to take. Naruto pictured the snake-faced man with a shudder, remembering his unnaturally pale skin and the golden eyes that shone with greed. According to Gurren, he previously had taken the body of a woman, the wife of a daimyo that had been held for ransom. But Orochimaru's form was clearly that of a man's. He had sucked up any trace of the original body and molded it into his own. Naruto imagined it happening to him, his golden hair turning black and his skin whitening while his eyes transformed into a dark yellow, his soul being locked away as Orochimaru took over his body. Naruto's eyes hardened. He had possessed little in Konoha, and in Otogakure, everything he had was only lent so that he could get strong enough for Orochimaru's liking. His body was the only thing that he could truly call his own. No way was that snake ever getting his greasy hands on it. Rolling over, he got off his bed and walked over to the bars of his cell. As usual, there was only the flickering torchlight to see by, but it was enough for Naruto to see the twisting corridor, just one of many that made up the maze of Otogakure. With guards patrolling every corner, Gurren or Kabuto accompanying him whenever he left the cell, and Orochimaru overseeing everything with undoubtedly great power at his disposal, it would be very difficult to escape. Very difficult but not impossible. Naruto watched the girls and boys file into the training room with Kabuto leading them, his eyes narrowed. He had been given a single kunai, while they all wielded bigger or faster weapons, some clumsily, some skillfully. Soon, they would all be matched up in pairs, and expected to fight each other, usually to the death. Some were looking nervous, while others were looking excited. Naruto eyed the arrogant ones with disdain. They thought that they had been made invincible with Orochimaru's meddling. He wanted to show them that they were wrong. Kabuto began to direct the children into pairs. Naruto was forced to wait until last, and he gasped when he saw his opponent. Ami's hair had been cropped short, the purple lock that had once framed her face now cut raggedly, hanging above her eyebrow. Her striped pink dress was now a pale gray, the result of living in a filthy cell for months. But that was not what drew his attention. It was the 3 tomo on her neck, that were positioned just above a twin pair of scars. Kabuto gave the signal to begin, and Naruto extended his arm, preparing to send forward the black threads and use them to deliver a blow to her head that would hopefully knock her out. But before he could do that, the girl began to change. The black marks spiraled outwards, sending a wave of inky darkness over her skin that covered her from head to toe. Her eyes rolled back, and turned a dark orange, while her teeth turned transparent. But the worst change was the fire that erupted from her head and hands, cloaking her hair and palms in a shimmer of red and black. Naruto could feel the heat from where he was standing, and he gulped. It looked like this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Amy turned to look at him, and grinned nastily, exposing her glass-like teeth. I'm gonna burn you to a crisp. Naruto crouched down and shot his arm towards the transformed girl, his bicep only attached to his shoulder by the black threads. But Amy only smirked, and sliced downwards. Naruto howled with pain as the threads were burned away, the flames eating hungrily at them like sharks devouring eels. Across the room, Kabuto watched them curiously. Naruto has received more instruction than Amy, but she has the curse seal, and she's been taught to use it more than he has been taught to use his abilities. This should be interesting. Naruto forced more black threads out, and made them connect to the charred remains, interlocking and strengthening them before he withdrew the reattached limb back to his body. Amy grinned, the madness caused by the seal dancing in her eyes. Is that the best you can do, loser? Naruto glared at her. I'm just getting started. With that, he sprang at her, his kunai raised. In retrospect, that probably was not the best plan. Amy sliced at him, and he was forced to constantly duck and dive, looking for an opening to use the kunai. His threads were no use in this situation, and he didn't like the thought of being burned to cinders. Amy had no such qualms, and seemed to be mindlessly chopping at him with her hands, teeth bared in a feral grin. Naruto saw an opening and dived for it, his kunai raised to plunge into her knee. Only to scream as her burning fist impacted with his chest, melting into a few centimeters away from his heart. Naruto tried to bite back his scream, but he was only partially successful. His vision was blurring, and all the sounds in the room seemed to have been muted, as if someone had pressed their hands against his ears. Pain was all that he could seem to feel, waves of agony pounding against his body. He was dimly aware of someone kneeling down next to him, but he paid them no heed. His vision was darkening, and he hoped that he was slipping into unconsciousness, because it would be so much better than this. Then his eyes snapped open, and he gazed around in wonder. His vision seemed to have cleared a little, like he had taken off a dirty pair of glasses. Amy was still swinging at him, but her movements seemed to have slowed down, which was odd, as he was pretty sure that the cursed girl would not have let up on her attacks. The pain was still there, but it seemed to be fading, and Naruto was able to ignore it as he sat up, unaware of the fact that the wound was slowly healing, the flesh being knitted together by black threads while charred skin was being replaced with fresh unmarred skin at an incredible rate. However, to Kabuto, this was not what he found most interesting. It was the fact that Naruto's cerulean blue eyes had turned scarlet, with a single tomo visible in either one. He's done it. He awakened the Sharingan, but it seems to be the normal Sharingan, not Itachi's. Oh dear. Orochimaru-sama will not be pleased. Heedless of the thoughts running through the head of Orochimaru's right-hand man, Naruto staggered up, glaring at Amy. She was too far gone in the lust of the curse seal to notice, and just flexed her fingers, taunting him. Naruto was all too happy to take up her challenge. Gripping his kunai, he lunged forward, his eyes drinking in every movement of the battle. Amy tried to dodge, but she was already tiring from using her curse seal, and Naruto was not prepared to lose. The kunai sank into Ami's shoulder, eliciting a scream from the fire-headed girl, who frantically slashed at him to get him to let go. But Naruto easily evaded her, and began to slowly drag the kunai downwards. That's enough. Naruto looked up to see Kabuto striding towards him, an annoyed look on his face. Naruto, you have won the fight. Amy is an important experiment. Stop it. Naruto gritted his teeth in anger, but pulled out the kunai, letting Kabuto go forward to heal Amy, who was now morphing back into her human state. Turning around, he walked away, noting bitterly that quite a few unmodified children were lying on the floor, bleeding out from where their partners had brutally hacked at them. There were no medics for them. Orochimaru scowled as he looked down at the report. Blast it. I wanted Itachi's Sharingan, not an ordinary one. Kabuto shrugged. Whatever Itachi has done to warp his Sharingan clearly cannot be passed on to his descendants. Frankly, the fact that he has a Sharingan at all makes him rare. There's only 3 people who can wield it currently: Naruto, Itachi, and Kakashi, though Itachi did leave his younger brother alive after the massacre, and he could well have the potential to awaken it. Orochimaru dismissed the mention of Itachi's brother. After all, why worry about some Uchiha brat with ordinary eyes when he had his perfect host locked up in Otogakure? Well, get back to training him. Now that he has awakened the Sharingan, we need him to achieve the full level, but don't show him any jutsu. The last thing I need is for him to start using our own attacks against us. Kabuto nodded, and turned to go, though he didn't really see why Orochimaru was worried. Even without Itachi's form of the Sharingan, Naruto would definitely not have an inferior dojutsu. After all, soon they would implant the Rinnegan, the dojutsu that, combined with Orochimaru's powers, would elevate his master to the level of a god. Naruto leaned against the stone wall, shuddering a little as the cold seeped through his shirt. He glanced around to see if anyone was watching, before leaning down and scratching a tiny U into the cracked stone. To anyone else, the U would be practically invisible amid the myriad of cracks that covered the wall, but Naruto had memorized its position so that he wouldn't forget it. He couldn't. It was his only way out. They had taken to let him walk around the tunnels for exercise, and after the first few times had gone well, they had started letting him wander without a guard. Naruto was not fooled by the illusion of freedom. He had heard the muffled thump of footsteps when there appeared to be no one there, had felt the chakra signatures that were never completely suppressed. They were always following him, and he knew that if he caused the slightest hint of trouble, they would be on him like a ton of bricks. However, just leaning against the wall didn't count as trouble, and they didn't realize his true purpose, putting markers on them. Otogakure was an endless labyrinth of corridors, but it was one that he would have to navigate if he wanted to get out. So on his walks, he had done his best to memorize the layout, noting where the guards were, where they patrolled, and what they guarded. He had discovered that most of them were centered around the laboratories, but there were also a few around the more important prisoners, and of course, the entrances and exits. Naruto was always forced back whenever he got near the latter, but that only told him where they were. And he had made sure to note down their position. He didn't know when he would be able to make a break for it, only that when he did, he probably would only have a short period of time in which to make his escape, and he knew that whether he got out depended on how well he knew the area. Naruto was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of sobbing. He rolled his eyes as he heard it. Crying was nothing new in Otogakure, but it was only the new prisoners that did it. All the others knew that it was no use, and only provided entertainment for the guards. However, his amusement was turned to irritation when the crying continued. He was trying to concentrate, and the stupid sniffling was interfering with that. Deciding to go and see who was crying and shut them up, Naruto strode down the corridor, following the sound of the sobbing. His search brought him to the cells of the unmodified prisoners, the ones that were just waiting for Orochimaru to pick them for one of his experiments that not even Orochimaru could really tell if they would survive. He scanned the rows of cells until he found the source of the crying, the little girl with the blonde hair that had come in with Amy. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking. Naruto tapped the front of the bars to get her attention. "Look, could ya please shut up?" The girl jumped, looking up in surprise. Clearly she hadn't heard him coming. He looked at her expectantly, but tears were still rolling down her cheeks. Naruto sighed with impatience. "Okay, what's wrong?" Sniffling, the girl shifted her arms, and Naruto saw that she was holding a small rag doll, with hair made from blue wool and a mouth of pink stitches. It was very grubby, and nothing like the dolls that the girls in Konoha had paraded around, but she was clutching at it as if it was the most precious thing in the world. As Naruto peered closely at it, he realized what she crying about. The doll's neck was fraying, and its head was 2 steps away from detaching completely. He stared at the girl in disgust. That's why you're crying. Your doll's falling apart. The girl nodded slowly, looking up at him tearfully. Naruto groaned inwardly. He wanted her to stop crying, but apparently the doll was precious to her, and she was going to keep on crying about its near decapitation. There seemed to be only one thing to do. Give it here. The girl looked up at him and hugged the doll to her chest tighter. Naruto's eyes narrowed. I said, give it here. Looking frightened, the girl leaned forward and gently pushed the doll through the bars. Naruto grabbed it, and then forced one of his black threads out of his body. It twisted through the air like a slender black snake, swaying back and forth as it waited for his command. Naruto pushed it into the doll's body, and it began to weave itself through the cloth, not only fixing the doll's neck, but also strengthening her other limbs as the girl watched in awe. When he was satisfied that the doll was fully repaired, he shoved it back through the bars. There. Now stop crying. The girl nodded, staring at the doll with wide eyes. Naruto straightened up and turned to go, intent on returning to his job of memorizing Otogaku. Gato. Naruto frowned, and looked back at the girl, who was peering at him through the bars. What did you say? Arigato. For mending Makoto-chan. Naruto looked from her to the doll, then back again. Okay. He had an odd feeling in his stomach, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He pondered on the feeling as he scratched, into the walls, as he was led back to the cell, as he was shoved inside. He was so determined to find out what it meant that he didn't even bat an eyelid when Kabuto told him that he would be having another transfusion the next day. Then, as he was lying on his bed, it hit him. That had been the first time anyone had ever thanked him for anything. It felt nice. Kabuto breathed a sigh of relief when he checked over Naruto. The boy was lying unconscious on the operating table, but he was breathing steadily, and everything seemed to have gone well. That was a relief. Despite Naruto's immortality, there was always the risk of something else going wrong, like brain damage or paralysis. Kabuto had no doubt that it would be his head if Naruto was unable to move. Orochimaru could not take over a host unable to fight. He lifted up Naruto's hand, studying the palm. A pair of lips were pressed together in the center, and Kabuto knew that they concealed teeth and a tongue, along with saliva that, when mixed with substances like clay and dirt, formed an explosive substance that was a heavy offense weapon. Such a thing wasn't really Orochimaru's style. The snake Sannin was more fond of subtle attacks, but it came from Akatsuki, which would make the ability much sweeter for when he used it against the organization. First, however, Naruto would have to be trained in how to use his new mouths. And he doubted that the boy would be happy. Naruto stared at his hand in disbelief. A gleaming row of teeth looked back at him, while a tongue darted out, running across the teeth before withdrawing back into the mouth. A look at his other hand told him that his fears were true, and they'd implanted one there as well. Next to him, Kabuto nodded in satisfaction. Well, everything seems to be working properly. Now we'll train you to use them. Naruto was so shocked at the fact that he now had mouths in his palms that he only nodded slowly. Kabuto pulled out a tiny lump of clay. Your mouths will turn this material into explosives, so we have to be careful. Kabuto paused, frowning. For some reason, an ominous feeling of doom had just come over him. Naruto walked back into the cells, listening to the door clang shut behind him and the footsteps of the guard quickly fade away. He snorted to himself. Though he didn't really interact with people outside Kabuto and Gurren, he knew that others in Odo talked about him sometimes, about how his body was changing every week, how he would eventually host Orochimaru. Now the guards looked at him with a bit of awe, and a small amount of fear. He liked that. It meant that they would leave him alone, that they wouldn't taunt him like they did the other prisoners. Even so, he couldn't help but feel lonely. Back in Konoha, at least he had the old man to pretend to be nice to him. Here, he had no one. One of his mouths clicked their teeth, and Naruto shuddered. He had been working with the clay that Kabuto had provided, and the results had been excellent. Though they only gave him small bits of clay, the explosions were still large enough to warrant a private training ground for whenever he used them. However, Naruto could never bring himself to like the unnatural things that spawned the explosions. Walking over to the pile of clothes in the corner of his cell, he rooted through them until he found the pair of fingerless black gloves that he had been provided with months ago, probably by someone who knew what was going to happen to him. But before he pulled them on, he carefully picked at the clay that was smeared around the edges of his mouths, collecting every scrap. Then he rolled it up into a small ball and added it to the pile under his bed that was slowly but surely growing day by day. Naruto frowned as he looked through the scrolls that had been left for him at the end of his bed. As usual, someone had left an anatomy scroll, but there was also a scroll about puppetry, which he had heard of, but never seen in practice. Picking it up, he looked through the scroll with interest. While he had no interest in being a puppeteer, there was very little to do in Oto when he wasn't training, and these chakra strings sounded interesting. My, you have grown, Naruto-kun, Orochimaru purred as he looked at the boy standing in front of his desk. I remember when you came here. You were so small back then. Naruto gritted his teeth. He hated this man, hated him with every bone in his body. Orochimaru had plucked him from his home, turned him into something, and was planning to steal his body, just because he was afraid of growing old. Naruto didn't know why Gurren wanted to be a host. To him, there could be no worse existence than being Orochimaru's vessel. Kabuto, standing behind him, nodded. Hi, Orochimaru-sama. Naruto-kun's body has responded well to the implants. Orochimaru nodded, his eyes gleaming as he looked at the Jinchuriki. I have 13 more months until I will need to transfer. That gives you plenty of time to implant the remaining abilities before we extract the Kyuubi. Extract what? Naruto interrupted, his face pale. The Kyuubi was a demon fox with 9 tails that had attacked Konoha years before. It had killed many of their ninja before the Yondaime had given his life using a jutsu to kill it, but the children in the playground had often whispered about how if you said its name 9 times, it would appear again. Orochimaru smirked, leaning forward. Oh, Naruto-kun, didn't anyone tell you the truth about the night the demon attacked? Naruto stormed through the corridors, too angry to even think about where he was going. Orochimaru was a master of lies and deceit, Naruto knew that well. But though Naruto desperately wanted to believe that this was just another of the snake's tricks, he knew in his heart that it was not. The hatred, the sneer, the whispers, the disdain. All of it made sense now. The Yondaime had not killed the Kyuubi like he had been told. Instead, he had sealed the demon into a container, and then left it in the hands of the village that would never see the container for what it was, only the demon that it housed. Though the Sandaime had forbidden anyone to speak of it to the children, the parents had passed on their hatred to their children, making sure that everyone treated the container as a pariah. Hell, if Naruto wasn't the container himself, he'd probably have been told to do the same. Slamming his hand against the wall, he glared at the cracks, remembering the monument back in Konoha, where he'd often sat on the Yondaime's head. The man was thought of as a hero by the whole of Konoha, and even he had been no exception. When the old man had told him about how the Yondaime had heroically sacrificed himself for his village, Naruto had thought that he was the coolest and bravest ninja he'd ever heard of. But that was no longer the case, not after what Naruto had learned. The Yondaime had been a coward. He had snatched up a helpless baby, someone who couldn't say no, and after sealing a demon inside him, he had died, thus freeing him of any responsibility, and leaving the baby to the mercy of a village that hated it because they couldn't see that he wasn't a demon. How hard is it to tell the difference between the Kyuubi and me? I'm not the Kyuubi. I never have been, have I? He gave a bitter laugh. Of course he wasn't. Because if he was, he would have had the power to destroy the village for what they did, and he obviously didn't have that. At least. Not yet. Suddenly, a scream rang through the air, jerking Naruto out of his thoughts. He looked up with a frown. He was nowhere near the laboratories, and that didn't sound like a new prisoner being frightened by the guards. So where had it come from? The scream came again and Naruto decided to find out what was going on. Following the noise, he sprinted down the corridors until he found the source. An Oto genin was shoved up against a wall by an older shinobi, who was leering as he tugged at her green top. The girl was kicking and shrieking, but she was no match for the much bigger man, and it looked like no one else was coming to help her. Really, it was none of Naruto's business. Though he didn't really understand what the man was doing, he had heard it happening several times before, and he knew that everyone was expected to keep out of it. But for some odd reason, maybe because the girl looked like she was his own age, maybe because he wanted to be thanked for something again, maybe because he still needed some reassurance that he wasn't the Kyuubi, he couldn't ignore it this time. Stretching out his arm, he sent a mass of black threads shooting towards the struggling pair. The threads wrapped themselves around the girl, who gave a yelp of surprise, before yanking her out of the shinobi's grasp. They retracted back into his body, releasing the girl, who was saved from hitting the floor as he grabbed her. The shinobi looked angry. "Stay out of this, boy. You have no." Then Naruto looked up, fixing the man with a cold glare. "Leave her alone." The shinobi stiffened, finally recognizing him as the boy said to be the one that was going to host Orochimaru. If he hurt this boy and his master found out, the consequences would be severe. Shooting him a dark look, he stomped off to find another, more willing female. The girl gasped, and Naruto looked down at her, seeing her properly for the first time. She had very long dark hair trailing down her back, pale skin, and dark eyes that were looking up at him in shock. "Why, you saved me." Naruto tilted his head as he considered this. "Yes, I did." "Why?" Naruto shrugged, and gently set her down. "Dunno." He turned to go, and she grabbed his arm. "Wait, who are you?" Naruto gave her a lopsided grin, a darker form of his once cheerful grin. "Naruto." With that, he strode off, leaving Tsuchi-kin staring after him with curiosity. Gurren snorted when she saw her student. "How long are you planning to stay up there, brat?" Naruto glared at her. He was hanging upside down from the branch of a tree, while his face seemed to be coated in leaves. While this would be seen as extreme training for most, he had no choice. Not only was his chakra control so appalling when he arrived at Otogakure that he had to do exercises like this for days just to bring it up to an average standard, it degenerated easily, meaning that he had to keep working at it just to maintain that average control. Gurren smirked at his expression. "Well, you can have a break now. Kabuto," her face twisted in bitterness, "wishes to see you." Naruto let the leaves flutter off his face before he dropped from the tree, flipping over to land in an awkward crouch. Gurren tutted. "You need to work on your landing. I've seen civilians that can jump from a tree more gracefully than that." Not bothering to point out that civilians wouldn't be able to hang upside down from a tree using only their feet in the first place, Naruto stalked off, Gurren laughing as she walked behind him. To Naruto's surprise, he was not taken to the laboratories, but to a training room, which was mainly used by the genin of Oto, due to the fact that it was too small for the really powerful ninja to train in. Kabuto and a shinobi with a slashed Suna headband were waiting in the middle of the room with some other children, one of whom was the little girl with the doll. She gave Naruto a tentative smile which he did not return. The ex-Suna ninja pulled out a scroll, and Naruto looked at it curiously. Then there was a puff of smoke, which cleared to reveal several puppets. They were simple things, with no faces or weapons, and Naruto guessed that they were used for training amateur puppeteers. Kabuto faced them with a smile. "You're going to be learning how to use chakra strings, which will let you control puppets. The art of puppetry is something." Naruto tuned him out as he narrowed his eyes at the silver-haired boy. Kabuto was Orochimaru's right-hand man, his personal medic, his spy. Naruto was sure that he had better things to do than oversee a simple class of puppetry. "No, There was something else going on, and Naruto had a nasty feeling that he wouldn't like it one bit. The puppet fell to the floor with a clatter, and Naruto swore. His chakra reserves were really too large for the kind of control needed to move the puppet as well as he wanted to. But that would be no excuse for Kabuto, and he knew that he would be forced to go through a variety of chakra control exercises so that he could get his control up enough to use the chakra strings. Sighing, he looked around the room. Some children were sitting down, having used too much chakra already. Others were still going at it, and Naruto saw that it was actually the younger children that were getting it the fastest, as their smaller reserves meant that they had more control. However, their smaller reserves also meant that they got tired more easily than the older children. Next to him stood the little girl with the doll. She was trembling with effort, and it was clear that she was going to have to stop any second. But for now, she had managed to make her puppet stumble around in a circle, a fact that she was clearly very proud of. Suddenly, her puppet dropped down, and the girl staggered. But before she could fall down like her puppet, Naruto leaned over and caught her, steadying her in his arms. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him and nodded slowly, though he could see that she was still very tired. Gently, he set her down, and smiled to himself. A demon wouldn't have cared about a little girl. He'd have let her fall. Kabuto walked to the middle of the room, speaking loudly to get everyone's attention. "I think that that's enough for today. You will return to your cells." Naruto turned to go, but the little girl was still clinging to his arm. He tried to shake her off, but she only held on tighter, swaying a little, and he realized that if she let go of him, she was probably going to fall over again. Kabuto looked at them, and smiled slightly, though there was no hint of warmth behind it. "Naruto, you can take Sayuri back to her cell." Naruto looked down at the little girl, and nodded. "Come on." He carefully began leading her away from the room and towards the cells where he had seen her before. The corridors were deserted apart from them, and the silence was very heavy to Naruto's ears. In an effort to break it, he smiled at the girl. "So, your name's Sayuri?" She nodded slowly, and looked up at him. "Who are you?" "I'm Uzumaki Naruto." It felt good to say his full name. Unlike his body, it hadn't changed at all, and it was something that Orochimaru would never be able to take for himself. Sayuri nodded, looking at him curiously. "That's a nice name." Naruto shrugged, the movement baring his shoulders. Sayuri frowned. "What are they?" Naruto reached up and clamped a hand across his shoulder, hiding the stitches. "Nothing." "Oh." They reached the cell, and Naruto gestured. "Go in." Sayuri looked at the bars fearfully and took a step back. Naruto sighed. "You have to go in, you know." Sayuri still looked unconvinced, and Naruto was getting impatient. "Look. Go in and I'll be back later." It was only a careless sentence to convince her to go in, but Sayuri looked quite happy. "Really?" Naruto nodded and suddenly realized that this probably meant a lot to her. Compared to the other prisoners, he was both the most captive and the most unbound. Free to wander around and interact with others, and yet followed everywhere until the time when Orochimaru would take over his body. Sayuri was an ordinary prisoner, and she had no knowledge of what would happen to her. Even so, she looked quite fragile, and probably wouldn't last that long. In that case, surely it wouldn't do him any harm to make her remaining time more pleasant by just dropping in to see her from time to time. "Yeah, really." Sayuri nodded, and slowly walked into the cell. The door closed behind her, and Naruto heard the footsteps of a guard approach, no doubt to lock it securely. The boy turned to go, but not before smiling at Sayuri, mouthing, "I'll be back later." Wham! Naruto's fist slammed into the dummy, which was hurtled back by the force of his blow. The impact had bruised his knuckles, but Naruto knew that there would be no permanent damage. The Kyuubi would see to that. After all, the whole reason why he had been selected was for the advanced healing it gave him. He was in one of the training rooms, practicing his taijutsu, a rough style that he had picked up by watching the moves Kabuto had demonstrated for him with his Sharingan activated. He didn't like using it particularly, as it ate up far more chakra that he felt it was entitled to, as well as the fact that to a boy who had had to work for everything, it seemed wrong to just steal techniques from others, but Kabuto had insisted, and it was the only way he got to practice it, as everyone was very careful for him to not view any jutsus with it activated. Uzumaki. Naruto turned around to see an Oto shinobi standing behind him. Orochimaru-sama wishes for you to come to Laboratory 6. Feeling nervousness twist in his gut, Naruto made his way to the laboratory, the shinobi walking behind him. He had known that more abilities would be implanted within him, but that didn't mean he liked the thought of more warping of his body. Orochimaru looked up as he came in, and Naruto gulped as he saw the row of gleaming surgical knives laid out on a table in front of him. Ah, Naruto-kun, come here. Naruto reluctantly walked over to the Sannin, who leaned over and picked up a needle. Now, stay still, Naruto-kun. Naruto winced as the needle pierced his arm, but the pain was soon numbed as he lost consciousness. Kabuto, who had been waiting behind Orochimaru, picked him up and put him on the operating table as Orochimaru began to prepare the next sample. Kabuto looked at it with a raised eyebrow. That one, are you sure? Orochimaru nodded, caressing the vials of the Akatsuki samples. Only 4 remained, one of which he was holding. The weapons of our shinobi would not do well against the Kage's abilities, while we are ill-equipped to deal with an escape via Zetsu's or Konan's powers. Therefore, it is best to leave them to last, thus not giving Naruto-kun much time to experiment with them. That leaves the Rinnegan. After all, we're not going to instruct him in how to use it. Kabuto nodded. As you wish, Orochimaru-sama. Darkness. Naruto was floating in a sea of it, unable to see anything at all. He could feel nothing beneath his feet, yet there seemed to be nothing holding him up either. He tried to move to the right, but there seemed to be no direction in this place. He couldn't tell which way he was going, or even if he could move at all. So cold, so hungry. Naruto froze as a voice echoed through his ears. He had never heard anything like it. It was soft as a feather, yet harsher than anything he had ever heard, as quiet as a mouse yet louder than any of the jutsus used by Oto, and entwined with a cold malice that terrified him. Whatever the voice was, he could tell that it was incredibly powerful, but also utterly evil. Once your kind feared me, now they forget me. Yet even now, you tremble before me. What? What are you? Naruto cringed as a cruel laugh sounded. I am the first, the most powerful. I am the one that even the god could not kill. I am the one that created Amaterasu, the one that sired Tsukuyomi, the one that birthed Susanoo. I am the nightmare from which your kind can never awake from, the shadow that you are forever trapped within. I gaze beyond time itself, I see into every life, I know every secret, and I know you. Quote. The boy tried to speak, but it was as if his voice had been sealed up by fear. He had never felt anything